Welcome everybody to our webinar on the future of executive pay in the UK. We've called this the Big Tent discussion, and that's really following the lead of the chief executive of the London Stock Exchange, who recently wrote about this in brief and suggested that a debate was needed on this subject. And it really is intended to be an open discussion. There are obviously lots of different views on this matter, on the question of executive pay and the future of executive pay in the UK. And so really this is an opportunity for people to think openly and to think in a sort of blue sky fashion about what we should do going forward. I'm joined by my MD colleagues here at A&M. That's David Tuck and James Harris. The webinar is also accompanied by our publication, Executive Pay in the UK, which you can see there on the screen. You can download that from the website or by using the QR code that's shown there on this page. The slides will be available after the presentation. We're also recording the webinar, so you can access it after we've spoken, if you wish to. And there will be some polling questions as we go along. Now, to access the polling questions, you'll need to use your phone. So have your phone at the ready, and you'll need to scan the QR code that will be shown on the relevant page, and that will then take you to the polling questions. So if we can now move on to the first of our slides. Thank you, James. So just to start things off, you see there the quote there from Julia Hoggett, the CEO of the London Stock Exchange, suggesting that this debate was necessary. And she also said in the article that she published, the brief article, that there's a feeling amongst many companies that the executive pay landscape in the UK is hampering the objective of recruiting and retaining talent in the executive space. She pointed specifically to the role of voting agencies in that and some asset managers. And she also pointed to the fact that there isn't really a level playing field for the UK in the guidance from those voting agencies relative to other countries, well, it's relative to the US, for example, where the voting agency guidance is very different from what we have in the UK. Another reason I think this is important, this debate, is we are now around the 10th anniversary of when the current voting regulations and DRR regulations were introduced. And it's 5 years also since the current version of the Corporate Governance Code was put in place, which introduced some new remuneration requirements for listed companies. So those two anniversaries we are reaching, which is another reason for really starting this discussion. The middle bar chart you can see there is quite interesting. It shows how the UK has been lagging, or is projected to lag, OECD peers in economic growth. So these are forecasts for the next for 2003 and 2023, 2024 for UK economic growth. And you can see there we're about 40th in the OECD in those forecasts. Now, obviously, there are lots of reasons for that, not least of which many people would point to Brexit and the impact of Brexit. But the question that begs for us is, does the structure and the landscape of executive pay in the UK have a part in that, in the growth and success of our companies, UK companies, and our economy? So we've split the webinar into three main parts. First of all, we've got a section on the data that we've been looking at and some of the observations around the trends over the last 10 years in executive pay. Then we've got a section on some of the practical ideas for change. Clearly, if there's a problem, we need to think about what would be the solutions, and there are many different ways of looking at the potential solutions, and we've got some suggested ideas to start things off, but we'd obviously welcome other views. And then lastly, we're also going to look at the role of RemCos and how they interact with shareholders and voting agencies. So we'll now move on to the first of those sections, and I'll hand over to James.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone. So the first section, as Jeremy said, is around a look back at some data and some observations on the UK market. Where are we now? How did we get here? We've tried to be in this section as objective and fact-based as possible, and we've got 4 themes to walk through. The first one is this concept of a premium that exists for US executive roles compared to UK roles, which is a good place to start because it's often cited as a drawback of the UK listed market. Julia Hoggett's statement referenced it, others often do. So we wanted to take a look at some hard data on this. So let me explain the chart first of all, which is the premium of a US listed CEO against the FTSE 100 median CEO total compensation. And in the US group, it's a group of 100 companies of broadly similar market cap. So not just the US market as a whole, but a sample of similarly sized companies. And what you can see is there's a premium for a US CEO role over a UK CEO role over the last 10 years. It started at about 1.5 times. It increased to, this is the blue line, increased to 2 times, and then up to even over 2.5 times that premium got to. And some of that was currency related. So the dotted line illustrates on a constant currency basis. And you can see in 2016, after Brexit and the sterling's devaluation, the depreciation, that had an impact too on this premium. But how should we interpret this? So, I mean, clearly for companies that are genuinely competing for talent in the US market, it's very challenging to compete on quantum and having to address that premium that exists in the US market. But at the same time, we're looking at the UK market as a whole, and we think it's important not to overplay this as the theme, as the main issue to solve. After all, it's not relevant for a lot of UK companies that don't compete in the US, might have international parts of their business, but they're not really genuinely competing in the US talent market. And indeed, it's not a new theme. So in all my time advising UK listed companies on pay, this has been the environment. And so to say that this is suddenly the issue to grapple with, other than for those companies that really are genuinely competing in the US, it's not particularly compelling for us. And we also note a common refrain from shareholders that UK companies should pay UK rates, UK listed. So we think looking against UK benchmarks is probably more interesting. So that's where we'll go next. So on this slide, we're looking at the total compensation of a UK CEO. So the single figure for a UK CEO, FTSE 100 CEO. In 2013, that was about just shy of £4 million, single figure. Over the next 10 years, it's fluctuated between sort of 3.5, 4 million, slight dip in 2020 with COVID. And in 2022, it was again just shy of 4 million. So over that 10-year period, the amounts received, as shown by the single figure by a FTSE 100 CEO, are flat. That's the thick blue line that you can see in the middle of that chart, which is tracking the percentage change over those 10 years. If we compare that with some other UK reference points, the first one is inflation. So UK inflation over that period has been just short of 50%. And this is up to the end of 22, so higher since then. Which means that the realized pay for a FTSE 100 CEO is 30% down in real terms over the last 10 years. UK CEO pay has also lagged other reference points. So UK worker pay, which is the blue line on the chart, and as you can see, that broadly tracked UK inflation until the last year or so, and also behind the increase in the average size of businesses market by market cap in the UK market. So it's quite a stark observation for us to make, and we need to get behind that. So how do we explain it? So first of all, salaries over that period have been largely flat. That is because it's slightly counterintuitive, as you might think that UK CEO salaries attract average employee pay. I think that there's been more salary freezes than one might recognise, and also bringing in new CEOs at a lower pay than lower level than the incumbents, probably part of that too. Pensions are clearly down over the period. There's two reasons for that. Firstly, most recently we've had the alignment with the employee pension rate has driven that, but equally at the start of this period we still had some more generous defined benefit pensions in there which were being phased out. So pensions down. Incentive opportunities over the period have increased. I think we'd all be aware of that. That's seen trends in the market over the last 10 years. But at the same time, amounts being received are down. And that doesn't necessarily reflect the percentage of maximum payout. It's more the share price environment. So this is received pay, which reflects the share price that's been delivered. And in the early part of this period, the average 3-year share price growth in our sample was 30%. And in the second half of the period, it was only 10%. So, I mean, that's performance pay at work, but it does show that it's had an impact on the amounts being actually received by FTSE 100 CEOs. And as Jeremy said, we try to balance this. There are different perspectives. So some might say, well, yes, you still get, £3 to £4 million a year. You're pretty well paid. And I think we also have to recognise that in the preceding 10-year period, UK CEO pay had gone from, at the turn of the century, roughly £1 million to £4 million at 2013. So there'd been a big increase prior to that. So you might say, well, is this a big problem? But equally, I think this trend is evidence of what we hear in the market anecdotally and talking to boards, that it's more challenging. It's more challenging now to recruit and retain UK CEOs. So that's quantum. But then let's move on to the structure and the operation of UK pay, UK executive director pay. So clearly there's been a lot of change in the last 10 years, as shown in the table. So things like deferral and holding periods and shareholding requirements have become more universally adopted. The levels have been higher. I don't want to walk through them all, but you'll all be aware of these kind of changes that we've had over the last 10 years or so. And each one of them has a very clear rationale in isolation. It's around improving alignment with shareholders, alignment with the shareholder experience, giving shareholders extra safeguards around remuneration. But our view is that over time, incrementally, when you take them all together, they collectively serve to chip away at the value, the perceived value of remuneration packages for executives in various ways. So they've extended the time horizon before remuneration is received, like deferral, holding periods, pushes out the time before you crystallize anything from the incentives you've earned. They have increased the level of uncertainty. So incentives are inherently uncertain, but things like greater use of discretion, greater threat of the use of malice or clawback has increased the uncertainty that you'll ever actually get the incentives that you think you've earned. And you might argue that even on fixed pay, the UK market's approach to pension and the fact that shareholders push changes to contractual pensions even increased uncertainty on fixed pay for the UK market. It goes without saying that this has all made the world more complex, more difficult to understand for stakeholders, participants and shareholders. And particularly for someone coming to the UK market without experience of the listed market, so from private business or from a different geography, this is all very complex to understand. We also increasingly understand this perception of an asymmetry in the way that packages are, principles are applied to packages. So for example, discretion. Discretion is a great principle in that it says, if the formula gives you the wrong answer, you should have discretion to adjust that as a committee to what you think the right answer is. But of course, in practice, it only really ever works, the data shows, to the downside. It's much more challenging to increase outcomes using discretion. And we're going to come back to discretion later on. And finally, these changes have created a greater divergence with other reference points for UK listed CEOs and executive directors. So one, greater divergence with their colleagues in the same, senior colleagues in the same business. So typically remuneration committees won't apply all of these types of provisions below the board, or if they do, they'll apply them to a lesser extent. It's also created a divergence with executives in other geographies. So for example, bonus deferral just still never seen in the US, perhaps outside of some regulated entities, but generally it's not seen in the US. So, I mean, our conclusion is we don't think the answer here is to simply roll back on all of these necessarily, but we think it needs to be acknowledged, the impact that these have had on the value and the perceived value for executives. And I think we think the market should look at ways to achieve some of the underlying goals here, but in a more simplified way, potentially with a bit more balance as to how some of the principles are applied, and with a bit more flexibility. So we'll come back to that. And finally, our fourth observation on the data is around incentive structure. So we're often told that one size does not fit all, so the saying goes. The Investment Association's working group, which you might recall in 2017, was put together to look at the UK market. And the first conclusion of that report was to say, RemCos should have more flexibility to choose an incentive structure that meets the business need. In reality, it hasn't worked out that way. The level of homogeneity in the UK market has not really changed. Performance shares and a very conventional design for performance shares, 3 years plus 2 holding, is still the dominant practice. Some types of incentive plan that had a bit more performance aspect to them, so matching shares, share option plans, have become less common. The use of hybrids, by which we mean more than one type of long-term incentive, so potentially performance shares combined with restricted shares or combined with options, used to be over 30% of the market 10 years ago, and probably 15 years ago may well have been higher, maybe 50% of the market, and that's collapsed into a very small part, less than 10% of the market. So, I mean, yes, that has some advantages. It's in sort of standardization. It's simple. It's easy for shareholders to understand, but at the same time, it reduces the level of flexibility that committees have to choose a structure or structures that meet the needs of the business. And I think if you look at that trend at the top there, you can see that restricted shares has been the main trend in the last 2 or 3 years. Greater use of restricted shares, and they tend to elicit a range of views, and we don't want to do a deep dive here. I mean, clearly there's some real benefits from restricted shares in the sense that, you know, they can help retention, they can help create a long-term shareholder stewardship type of culture, but at the same time there are legitimate concerns among those who've implemented them or among shareholders that what do they do to the performance culture of the business? And the chart we've got there is a simple illustration of the payoff curve between restricted shares and performance shares. And you can see this kind of flatter nature of the restricted share curve. So the argument might go, you know, given the certainty of vesting, does that mean there's too much protection in situations when performance isn't good? And equally, the other side of the argument is, do committees have enough ability to drive and reward exceptional performance like they have with the performance share plan? So I think that our conclusion, however, is that the big problem with the UK market is that committees are forced to make a choice, to make a binary choice between either performance shares or restricted shares, and are not able to potentially combine them to get the benefits of both and choose the type of mix that reflects best their circumstances. So companies that have performance shares might think, I'd like a bit of an element of restricted shares, a bit of certainty, but I can't have that. Equally, companies that have introduced restricted shares might say, well, I'd quite like a bit more of an upside potential, a bit more performance, but you can't combine them. And of course, in the US, having more than 2 long-term incentive plans is 95% of the market. So we bring all this together and we say, our main conclusion in the report is that it's reasonable to conclude that packages for executive directors have become less attractive. And again, that aligns with the anecdotal experience we have of talking to boards and remuneration committees about the challenges they face in hiring the talent they need. But as Jeremy said, we have to recognise there are different perspectives here. So, there is a view that CEO roles do get filled. They are relatively well compensated. So we were facing an ongoing cost of living environment crisis, as what you might call it. So is this a priority? Is fixing the pay for a handful of key roles the priority? And while we recognise that view, I think our view is that if the objective of the UK market is to foster an environment of growth and performance for its constituent companies, then access to really high quality levels of high quality caliber of leadership teams is really important. But we also want to, if we want to fix this, we don't think this is necessarily a zero-sum game where anything to fix the issue and make packages more attractive for management necessarily means it's just, well, this is better for management, it's worse for shareholders. We'd like to look at ways in which we could make packages more attractive without compromising some of the core principles which have been embedded in the UK market for many years. There's no silver bullet solutions, so I'll pass on to David shortly. He'll talk through some of our ideas. But before we do that, we wanted to run a couple of polls just to get the audience's view around some of these points I've been making. So subject to the technology working, what should happen here is you should be able to click on use your phone to navigate to that QR code. And then the first question is, how much of an issue has this really been for you? So has the UK market's approach to executive pay caused in practice in your businesses a material issue in the recruitment or retention of executive director talent? And it updates in real time, so it's kind of fun watching it move.
So it looks like it's settling there at about
quite interesting, isn't it?
About 65-35, which is interesting. 65% of people saying no and 35% saying yes. I should have mentioned at the beginning, if you want to ask a question during the webinar or towards the end of the webinar, as you choose, you can do that. You can either use the Q&A function at the top of the screen or the chat function at the top of the screen. Feel very free to ask questions, make comments as we go along.
It's a very interesting poll response, though, isn't it? Because I mean, I do think that there is an element here of trying to. It's really hard to quantify in some way the extent of the problem. And I was talking to someone in the investment community about this recently, and that was exactly their response. We recognise these issues, but how much of an issue really is it? I do find that slightly surprising, though, from talking to my clients over the last couple of years, I think, but really interesting to get the views of this audience. And we'll move on to the next one, which is, I guess it's for that 35% that recognized an issue for their business. I've spoken about two sorts of themes. So the first issues were about quantum, the US premium, the kind of the flat nature of CEO pay and how it's fallen in real terms. And then I spoke about structure and operation of the packages. And what we're trying to do here is understand where's the big problem. Is it more about the quantum issue, or is it more about how we structure and how we operate packages? Again, this one's looking very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, so it looks like more or less 80-20. 80% of people think it's about structure and operation rather than quantum.
Which is actually very interesting news, because I don't want to steal David's thunder, but when we have 4 ideas and 3 of them relate to structure and only one's around quantum, so we're sort of aligned with the thinking in this poll. But that's an even more pronounced than poll 1, but really interesting. So I think with that, I will hand over to David for our next section.
Okay, thanks very much, James, and good morning, everyone. So James has already highlighted we've got a very highly homogenous nature of the UK market when it comes to long-term incentive design. We'd argue that the market should be much more amenable to a greater variation, recognising that one size does not fit all. Just to be clear also, we're not trying to push any particular product or solution here. As we've said, there's no one silver bullet. And we don't think the answer is complex innovation of some new kind of incentive plan. The many types of incentive structures are already widely understood, and the key, we think, is to allow their implementation or combination in ways that are most suitable for each company. So in our paper, we've looked at 2 specific ideas. First is the concept of a hybrid, which James has already mentioned. So rather than being compelled to choose just one type of long-term award, companies could seek to combine the benefits from different types of plan. Most obvious is perhaps a combination of performance shares and restricted shares, which, as the chart shows with the dotted or dashed brown line in the middle, would allow companies to plot the right balance between the benefits of certainty and downside protection from RSUs, with the upside potential from the performance shares. If you currently use performance shares, then clearly introducing this would give you some of the benefits that you get from RSUs without completely moving away from the performance element. Conversely, if you'd already moved to restricted shares, this could be a way to introduce some upside potential to drive performance. And then finally, for companies competing in the US, it would also align with established practice in that market. We also think that the opposition to hybrids on the grounds of complexity is overdone. The concept of having 2 awards is not that challenging to understand, and there are even ways to implement a hybrid as just one share award. In fact, I remember doing one about 18 years ago. It seemed to work fine then. Our second idea comes back to the concept shown earlier. If the UK equities market objective is to structure the performance and growth of its companies, so is to support the performance and growth of its companies, then should incentive structures which more directly align to that purpose be more acceptable? The 3 examples shown on the right are all types of plan that we have worked with clients on. They're clearly not right for all companies, but they all share the characteristic that they help to support a performance culture, they signal a growth objective, and they provide the wealth creation opportunity to energise its delivery. All of these ideas would currently face a set of well-rehearsed counter-arguments from some of the UK institutional investors and also the investor bodies. These can be very valid, but it's important to recognise that every type of incentive arrangement has drawbacks. Arguably, the problem lies in the rigid application of these counter-arguments, which forces most companies in practice to follow the standard approach merely to enable the proxies and investors to tick a box and hence ensure a high level of shareholder support, rather than assessing the benefits and risks based on their company's specific circumstances. So implementation of any of these would not be easy in the current environment. And our experience is that it takes quite a lot of shareholder consultation to actually put in place one of these arrangements. Jeremy's going to come back to this in the final section. Moving on though, when we think about how incentive plans are operated. So, UK Corporate Governance Code is very clear. Incentives should enable the use of discretion to override the formulaic outcome. This is absolutely the right principle for the market to adopt. Committees need flexibility to make the right judgments on outcomes. However, in practice, committees have relatively limited flexibility when making decisions around incentive outcomes for executive directors. Less so than they do for below board roles, or indeed would exist across the wider private sector. We think greater flexibility would help and have identified 2 areas. First is the key one on the left. In theory, discretion should be capable of being used in both directions, to decrease or increase outcomes if the formulaic answer doesn't provide the right answer. In practice, it is currently almost always operated in the downward direction to reduce outcomes. Why is this a problem? Well, it feeds the perception that James discussed earlier that executive pay is managed in an asymmetric way, but also it might start to negatively influence the target setting process itself. Could committees set softer targets than they otherwise might in the knowledge that they have the tools to reduce the final outcome if it's too high, but not the tools to increase the final outcome if it's too low? So we would argue that the market should look to foster greater acceptance of the use of upward discretion. All stakeholders have a part to play in this. For shareholders and proxy agencies, instead of applauding downward discretion and being sceptical of upward discretion, we would urge greater consideration of whether the overall outcome is reasonable, however it has been arrived at. And companies need to take a robust and responsible approach to using positive discretion. Those that can establish their credibility for doing so, perhaps by demonstrating a track record of downward discretion first, and or by ensuring that a compelling explanation is disclosed, may be better placed to secure support. If the first idea tends to elicit broad agreement from various stakeholders, the second, the one on the right, is perhaps much more contentious, but it fits within the general theme of providing committees with greater flexibility, and we raise it here primarily to inform a debate. The inability to reset PSP targets is a very well established principle in the UK market. It was severely tested by the COVID pandemic. Ultimately, very few companies attempted to reset targets, and those that did tended to face significant opposition. Our experience in UK listed boardrooms at the time was that this felt draconian for many executive directors, particularly when many were under unprecedented levels of pressure as they navigated the pandemic. And we're also seeing their direct reports having incentive targets reset or replacement awards issued. So while we do not support unbridled flexibility to reset PSP targets, we wonder whether the market could establish some principles which might make it more palatable, ensuring that they recognise the shareholder experience. And we've got some examples of the things that we might put in. So we're really focusing here on material exogenous events, not simply a downturn in performance, and not, for that matter, something internal, such as a major acquisition or disposal, where actually RemCos are already able to adjust performance targets. The second is perhaps quite contentious as a condition, but it might be that we would argue that you would only make these adjustments in the early stage of a performance period, not towards the end. Probably, particularly where targets are being lowered, we might need to agree some sort of reduction in the level of opportunity being offered to people, maybe 50% even. One of the challenges of this is, and we've already got this, but it's probably harder in this case, is we'd want to try and reset those targets so that we retain the same level of stretch. And of course, come the next AGM, shareholders get the chance to vote retrospectively at the AGM as they do with any PSP target. So if we've got it wrong, shareholders can still object. And finally, I think it needs to operate in both ways. If we're going to be able to adjust for negative events, we also ought to think about adjusting for positive external events as well. However, in reality, we're not hopeful that the market will ultimately be able to agree on anything to support resetting PSP targets. It's probably simply too embedded and controversial. But agreeing to a more balanced approach of upward and downward discretion does seem a reasonable objective for the market to aim for. So, moving on. James, can you? Thank you. So one of the things that we looked at was we've ended up with often a patchwork of rules and requirements that all do the same thing, that are all designed to encourage long-term executive shareholding. We have bonus deferral, we have PSP holding periods, we have shareholding guidelines or requirements both in employment and now post-employment. I think it's probably right that all of us would agree that actually requiring executive directors to build a meaningful long-term shareholding should be maintained as a key principle in the UK market. However, the question is whether we could find some way of coming up with a mechanism which robustly achieves this in a much simpler form, which therefore benefited all stakeholders. So we've set out here one way that we might do this. How would it work? So it's not that different to where we are now. We start off by setting a percentage of salary, which the executives aim to build up and retain. Then every time an incentive vests, whether it's a short term or a long term, we test to see whether that shareholding is met. If it isn't, then some portion, we'd need to agree what that is, whether it's 50%, 25%, 100% even, needs to be directed into what we would call an executive share account. The company would control the release of shares from this account until 2 years post cessation. That also enables them to, you can use it to effect clawback if you needed. So we've got a robust structure which we know shareholders want. If the shareholding test is met when that incentive vests, then the executive is free to dispose of any shares in the usual way. Clearly, calibration is required by individual companies to set the various key things. So, for example, you need to set what the percentage of shareholding is that you need to acquire, what the level of vesting, so what percentage on each vesting you would put into the account, whether the account operates on a gross or net of tax basis. But the key point, I think, is that it achieves the basic underlying principle, but hopefully simplifies everything. We don't have to have automatic bonus deferral, as conventionally understood. We don't have a separate PSP holding period, a period over which you're required to satisfy the test. And but we do have a robust mechanism for building up and retaining the shareholdings, which can then be kept through to the 2-year post cessation. Clearly, those companies with specific regulatory obligations, for example, perhaps in the financial services, will need to ensure that those were met. There's obviously a range of other variations that could be considered. For example, you could structure packages so that a relatively small percentage of base salary is also automatically transferred into the executive share account, ensuring that meaningful shareholdings can be built over time, irrespective of the outcome of incentive awards. So, moving on to the one that actually would appear not to be so much of a problem, but to the extent quantum is an issue, is there anything that we can do to try and deal with that? Reality is that some companies simply need to offer higher pay. I think we should also ask ourselves the question, is it realistic to assume that UK PLC can remain competitive when it comes to hiring and retaining executive directors if we have another 10 years of total compensation being broadly flat in absolute terms and hence materially down in real terms? Having said that, quantum is likely to continue to be highly sensitive, and so there's no easy solutions to this, but some things that we might think about. Benchmarking. We all know that simply saying we've increased salaries because we've fallen behind the benchmarking doesn't go down very well with shareholders. However, this broader version to the use of benchmarking is not really sustainable or credible in the face of the commercial reality of talent markets. Setting the pay for any role in any business requires some market assessment. Why should this be different for executive directors? Greater shareholder acceptance of benchmarking also requires companies and remuneration committees to use it responsibly. So we don't advocate a return to the old world where benchmarking was often undertaken too freely, applied too formulaically, everyone strived to be at the upper quartile. Comparator groups need to be relevant, they need to be robust, we need to be comfortable about setting pay around the median, for example, not necessarily at or above it. Because without responsible approaches to benchmarking, it's difficult to imagine that shareholders and proxy agencies are going to be more accepting of it. I think also we need to think about making sure that we keep that really strong alignment between performance and pay, and therefore to the extent we're going to deal with trying to increase quantum, it's probably in the context of the incentive plans that we should be looking to do that rather than just increasing base pay a lot. And then finally, I think actually to the more and more committees are getting more and more concerned about what's happening below the board as well. So being able to demonstrate that what we're doing is not just for the executive directors, but for the wider population, that gain sharing approach, I think that would also help us. Having said that, just on salary, I think there's a bit of a danger coming up. We've had for some years the idea that executive director salary shouldn't increase by more than that in line with the rest of the workforce. The last year or so, we've now got a discount to the rest of the workforce. I think it'd be rather worrying if that discount then became a sort of a required thing to put in place. We don't need rules like that. Finally, though, I think what is important if we're going to do anything on this is we have to improve the quality of the disclosure. It's quite clear when you look at companies that get adverse votes against for increasing comp, in many cases it's because of the disclosure rather than what they've actually done. Because for every 3 companies that increased comp and got a significant vote against, you'll find 3 that did it and didn't get a significant vote against. So we need to be perhaps better about sharing why the benchmark data tells us we've got the wrong numbers, and we need to do more about ensuring that we're demonstrating an alignment between pay and performance. So just before I move over to Jeremy for the last bit, let's try again 2 more questions for you. So first one, would you be interested in exploring the adoption of a hybrid arrangement in your company, whether it's performance shares and restricted shares or performance shares and options, if the UK market was more amenable to doing that? Where are we going to settle? That's looking very high.
That's pretty comprehensive, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, not much sitting on the fence there.
That's very interesting. Okay, next one.
Next one, please. Discretion.
This one.
Discretion. In your business, has the Remuneration Committee ever wanted to exercise positive discretion, but felt unable to because of the potential investor response? Again, pretty strong, not quite as strong. No. That's interesting. Okay.
Pretty close, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Broadly 50-50. Okay. Thanks for that. Jeremy, over to you.
Okay. So RemCos are obviously at the heart of this, and we wanted to just talk a little bit about the environment for RemCos and the relations between RemCos and voting agencies and shareholders. And I think the sense we have, if you look at the 2 boxes here, the sense is, I think, for a lot of RemCos that the UK environment has become increasingly rules-based, even though the guidance from shareholders and voting agencies is presented as such, as guidance. In practice, it does feel very much like a set of rules, and that's because the voting agencies, the 3 main voting agencies, ISS, IA, Glass Lewis, exert a very high level of influence over the voting outcome, and that's partly because the UK market, the stock market, has become more fragmented. You don't have the dominance in the UK market of the large pension funds and insurance funds that we had when this guidance was first being published. And so a lot of shareholders are relying heavily on voting agency guidance when they cast their votes. And if a voting agency recommends that shareholders vote against, many institutions are following that almost by default. And we also have this principle that if you get a vote of 20% or more against a resolution, an AGM resolution, consequences follow from that. You are entered on the IA's register, a public register. You also have to engage in further consultation with shareholders and explain the outcome of that consultation. And that focuses RemCo's minds on avoiding getting to that 20% against threshold, which is one of the reasons why the guidance from voting agencies feels like a set of rules rather than a set of guidelines. I think the other issue often is fragmentation of guidance. The voting agencies don't all agree on what they think is important, and where institutional shareholders publish their own guidelines, often they are different or even contradictory, which presents RemCos with dilemmas in how to interpret them and how to apply them. If you look at the number of companies that have actually been entered onto the IA's register for having 20% or more against an AGM resolution, interestingly, 220 different companies have been entered on that register since 2017 when it was started, which is about 40% of the UK market, which suggests that being on the register is not a result of introducing some egregious policy or remuneration practice. It's a bit more routine than that, as most companies seem, or many companies seem to have ended up there at some point. The other interesting thing, if you look at the pie chart, is having an ISS vote against recommendation is very highly correlated with getting a significant vote against. So 20% or more against, 78% of those companies who got 20% or more against had an ISS against recommendation. So ISS is a major driver, but it's not the only one. Glass Lewis to some extent, and the IA to some extent as well. If we go to the next slide, please, James. So how could this environment be improved for RemCos, but also potentially for shareholders and other stakeholders? We think obviously at the root of this is the level of trust between shareholders and RemCos. RemCos are populated by non-executive directors, and shareholders empower those non-exec directors to make decisions on their behalf in their interests. But when it comes to remuneration, it seems there isn't an enormous amount of trust, and very often the RemCos feel straitjacketed by the rules or guidance that they're given and the voting outcomes that they're presented with. So I think what would be interesting would be to see if it would be possible to come to a more principles-based approach with some key principles, a smaller number of key principles around how pay should be structured, but allowing more room to maneuver and more room for innovation by RemCos within that framework of principles. And part of it is also having perhaps a more straightforward and honest debate about talent, executive talent. Very often the tension seems to be between RemCos who are concerned about being able to recruit, retain and motivate the talent that they need to run the company well, and shareholders saying, but you can't do what you need to do in remuneration to achieve that. Or you can't do what the RemCo feels is necessary to achieve that. It's not always the case. Not all RemCos are faced with this tension, but there certainly are. There seem to be many examples of it. And then turning to the IA register, I think the question it begs is whether 80% is the right threshold, particularly for the advisory vote on the remuneration report. You know, does a vote of more than 20% against on an advisory vote on a remuneration report indicate that there's some great breakdown in agreement or consensus between a company and its shareholders, or is it merely just a difference of view, and it may be a difference of view on something that's not actually central to the remuneration policy or the remuneration approach, but has led to a vote against recommendation from voting agencies. So, of course, in the current environment, without changes to the guidance or to the way that shareholders are interpreting it, it does very much come down to RemCos actually being prepared to stand firm if they want to do something that they think is in the best interest of the company, stand firm and present it to shareholders, explain it well in the remuneration report, consult on it, and then trust shareholders to vote on it. That's really the only option they have, unless and until the guidance is changed. So that's the sort of current position that we're faced with. That covers our slides. I don't think we've got another polling question. So we do have some questions that people have been posting. So perhaps we could have a look at some of those. So we've got a question here around the difference between executive director packages and the levels below, and what thoughts we have on that. I guess an initial thought I would have is there is in some companies a noticeable gap in the structure and the approach to remuneration between exec directors and the level below, even the executive committee members who are not board members. And I think that is an indication in some companies of the problem that Remco sometimes face, where they want to have a consistent approach for their executive team, but actually they're forced to do some things for their exec directors in the way the package is structured that they're not required to do for other ExCo members, and they choose not to do for other ExCo members. So I think one of the questions here is, if Remco's had a bit more flexibility and some of the ideas that we've been talking about were permitted, would that actually enable Remco's to have a bit more uniformity in the approach to comp between the directors and other ExCo members? Any other comments, James and David, on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I on the first question, I agree. I think one of the things that was really stark to me was the difference in the amount of flexibility, the options available for committees during COVID, when long-term incentive plans were wiped out through no fault of the, this is one of these exogenous events, material events that we talked about. And for senior executives below board, there was a huge amount of flexibility to either reset targets or cancel awards and replace them with something else, or do some other means of compensation to get the right commercial answer for that group. And yet hands were tied at the executive director level. And I think that led to some real tensions across the UK market, in my experience, because the CEO could see that issues were being fixed in a reasonable way for their direct reports, but not for them. So yes, I think a bit more flexibility to allow committees to address that sort of thing, for me, would be welcome.
Just to pick up maybe on a couple of the other questions quickly, I'm conscious we're technically nearly out of time, but if people are happy to stay on, we'll carry on chatting for a bit, but obviously people need to move on, we understand that. So there's a question here around if we had a hybrid scheme, given that the sort of standard approach is how do you switch from PSP to RSU and what's the discount, and it's typically 50%. How do you work out what the right level if you've got a hybrid? And I think the answer is you use exactly the same approach, assuming you're not trying to increase at the same time total target comp. You take part of what was the PSP and switch it into RSP. So I think that's relatively straightforward. I think the second one, which isn't really a question perhaps, but is more a statement of the obvious, and I think you're absolutely right, Siobhan, is maybe the answer is Remcos have to get more comfortable about getting less than 80% support, because it's only by doing that actually they're going to be able to start doing things differently, as a result of which perhaps market practice starts to change, as a result of which maybe the guidelines that are being written start to fall in line with what actual market practice is, as opposed to what someone thinks it ought to be.
We've also got a question here on performance metrics and whether it's an overly homogeneous approach to the choice of performance metrics. For example, do you have to use TSR? Who's best placed to determine the choice of metrics, management or shareholders? Any comments on that, James or David?
It's a really interesting question, because as I showed in one of my slides around performance share plans staying the dominant model. Of course, they are just the underlying architecture for the award, and there is a lot of flexibility for companies to bespoke the metrics to their own business. That's the way that you can use a conventional PSP, but make it specific to your business. And I think to me, it's the board and the remuneration committee whose responsibility it is to, first of all, set the strategy and the KPIs that reflect that strategy, and then the remuneration committee to determine the best way to fit those into an incentive plan. And there's some decisions to make around prioritization. You know, if you have too many metrics, you dilute them all. You know, you have to reflect on your shareholders' feedback. But I mean, if there's a particular shareholder who wants TSR, but the business doesn't want it, then we're into this discussion of the Remco saying, well, you know, are we prepared to take a slightly lower vote to do what we think is right? And that would be always my advice and my encouragement to the committees, is to do what they think is right for the business.
And there's a question there, David, about a company with an RSP wanting to add a PSP. Presumably the kind of hybrid that you were talking about earlier could encompass that.
So I think, again, this is almost just the reverse of the previous one, which is if you did, I don't know, let's say you did PSP originally one-time salary and you switched that to RS restricted shares at 50% of salary, and then you wanted to go back to doing a hybrid, you'd take part of that 50% and replace it with twice that. So if you could, for example, take the 50% down to 25%, and the other 25% of salary would be a 50% PSP instead, and that would still give you the same total target comp. So clearly you can play around with that, and I don't think there should be. Again, we need to avoid there only being one approach to doing this. You know, we don't want to be in a position whereby if you want to use PSP and restricted shares together, you have to do it on the following way, because again, that's not what we're trying to suggest here.
Then there's a question on whether there's a correlation between votes against REM policies, new REM policies, and then votes against the remuneration report in subsequent years. In other words, you know, do investors actually follow through when they oppose a policy? Do they follow through and then oppose its implementation as well?
Yes, it's a trend we're starting to see. I think it's an emerging theme. So I think it used to be the case that if you had a low vote on the policy, the slate was sort of wiped clean the next year, and shareholders and the agencies would say, well, okay, we understood, you know, we expressed our opposition, and now we move on with what was approved. I think there's been a bit of a change, and it's slightly nonsensical, because there's this idea that if you received 20% or 25% against, but you still made the decision to go ahead because you thought as a committee was the right thing to do, that somehow that means you haven't addressed, because you haven't addressed the minority issue, the issue from that minority, and particularly when it's driven by ISS, they just, you know, it could go on forever. ISS could continually keep recommending against, and it's difficult to see, unless ISS change their position, how we get out of that. And my advice, I think, is that the committees need to be aware that that's a greater risk and be prepared to accept the consequences of having to deal with that. Because I do think it's a theme that we are coming across more commonly.
Okay, a few people have asked whether we're going to send out the recording and the slides. Yes, we are. To people who've registered, we'll be sending those out. I think we've pretty much covered the questions. There were a few other comments, but I think we pretty much covered the questions that have been posted. So thank you all very much for joining us today. I hope it's proved interesting and has stimulated some thoughts and some discussion. This discussion obviously is not going to end here. It will carry on, and I'm sure we will be part of it alongside many others. But thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.